How many times have you looked at someone sleeping on the sidewalk and thought their life was already lost? The asphalt was still damp from the early morning rain when James opened his eyes. The gray New York sky seemed to weigh down on his soaked, shivering body. Around him, the city's noise never stopped. Honking horns, hurried footsteps, voices ignoring his presence. James was invisible, as if the world had decided he no longer deserved to be seen. His blanket was a torn piece of dirty tarp, his pillow an empty backpack, and his bed, a slab of concrete behind a metal dumpster in Hell's Kitchen. At 50, James was one among thousands. Another face marked by time, by the traumas of war, by the pain of being nobody. But there was something different in that weary gaze. A hidden spark. As if, even buried under misery, there was still a grain of hope. Small, almost imperceptible, but stubbornly alive. He had no money, no family, no home. But he had something no one could steal, the memory of who he once was, and the silent dream of who he might still become. That morning, he clutched an empty paper cup, not because he believed anyone would give him coins, but out of persistence, routine. And when a suited man hurried past without a glance, James muttered to himself a phrase no one heard, but it changed everything. I'm not going to die here. This isn't a common story. It's not about charity, nor about luck. It's about raw pain, quiet faith, and the brutal strength of a man who decided to rise when the whole world pushed him down. But beware, this story will confront you. It will move you. And maybe it will transform you. If you believe there are still stories worth telling, stories that inspire, hurt, and heal, then subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Not for me, but for James. Because you don't yet know his journey. But when you do, you won't forget. But before you meet the James the world applauds today, you need to walk with the James the world ignored. The nights were the worst. Not because of the cold, though it cut like a blade. Not because of the hunger, though it burned his stomach like a slow fire. But because of the loneliness that screams in the silence of the early hours, when all footsteps fade, and all that's left is the sound of your own breathing. Heavy, gasping, full of anguish. Those were the hours when James thought most about giving up. No one was waiting for him. No phone calls. No address to return to. Just the icy concrete of a city that never sleeps, but always forgets. James was a veteran. He served nearly a decade in the U.S. Army. He faced combat in the Middle East. He saw death up close, heard bombs explode meters away, carried friends in his arms who would never return. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for what he'd face when he came home. There were no medals for those fighting their own trauma. No honor for those trying to survive without a roof. The memories of war, the nightly nightmares, the constant anxiety, all of it became invisible in the face of the street's indifference. He tried. He picked up odd jobs, cleaned bathrooms, unloaded boxes, slept in temporary shelters, but the system was cruel. Without a fixed address, he couldn't get a job. Without a job, he couldn't get housing. Without housing, he was treated like a burden. In no time, he lost his documents, lost what little he had, lost even the will to try. The pride he once wore with his uniform now weighed him down, stopping him from asking for help. Every no he heard on the sidewalks was a new scar on his soul. One early morning, with his stomach empty for 2 days, James rummaged through a dumpster behind a supermarket. He found half a sandwich, bitten, old, wrapped in a dirty napkin. He hesitated, his eyes filled with tears, not from emotion, but from shame. This was the point he'd reached. A man who swore to protect his country, now fighting rats for scraps. It was there, in that dimly lit alley, that James knew he'd hit rock bottom. And rock bottom, contrary to what people say, isn't a place of learning. It's an abyss, a dark hole where hope dies slowly. But it's also a place where decisions that change everything are born. It's where some choose to stop, and others choose to start again. And it was in that exact alley, amid tears and trash, that something, or someone, ignited the spark he didn't even know he still had. The spark came from where James least expected. It was a gray morning, like so many others, but there was something in the air. Maybe it was the strange silence before the streets came alive, or maybe it was just another day when he decided not to give up. Sitting on the sidewalk of a closed cafe, with numb feet and an empty stomach, James watched people pass by. Face after face, no glances, until a young woman in a hoodie and earbuds stopped. Without a word, she crouched down, pulled a bag from her backpack, and handed it to him. Inside was a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a handwritten note. She smiled with her eyes, as if seeing the invisible, and walked away before he could thank her. James opened the note with trembling hands. It was a simple sentence, but it hit his soul like thunder. "You still matter. Get up." He read it over and over, first with disbelief, then with anger, and finally, with tears. In that sentence was something more powerful than any coin, any meal. There was recognition, and more than that, there was a command. Get up. It wasn't a request, it was a call, a challenge. That night, James didn't sleep. He couldn't. The phrase pounded in his mind like a war drum. Get up. By morning, he didn't beg for change. He went to a public library. He was dirty, ashamed, but he went. He washed his face in the bathroom, tried to pull himself together, and spent hours at a computer trying to remember how to make a resume, how to look for work. His fingers were rusty, his mind doubtful, but the effort was real. For the first time in years, he was trying something different, not waiting for something to happen, but making it happen. In the days that followed, he went door to door. Cafes, markets, small shops. The no still came, and it came often, but something inside him had changed. He was no longer the same man broken by the sidewalks. He stood taller, more focused. A street vendor saw James persisting and, without much fuss, offered a chance. "Want to help me sell water on the corner? I'll give you a cut." James said yes on the spot. Not for the money, which was little, but for the dignity of doing something. The first sale was like an explosion inside him. When a dollar bill passed from one hand to another, James didn't just see money. He saw respect. He saw possibility. He kept that dollar folded in his pocket like it was gold. It was the first brick of his rebuilding. With the little he earned, he started eating better, used public restrooms to stay clean, visited the library every day, watched videos, read articles about street businesses, entrepreneurial mindset, even sales techniques. It was as if his mind, once dormant, was starving for knowledge. He had nothing, but inside him, something was growing with unstoppable force. And so, with a water bottle, a note, and a choice, James took the first step on a journey that would take him far beyond the streets. James didn't have a company. He didn't have a known name. But in that moment, he was already a different man. Every step he took was a silent declaration of war against the misery trying to define him. And it wasn't an easy war, far from it. There were days when selling water barely earned enough for a sandwich, nights when his body begged for rest and his mind nearly gave in to despair. But James kept going. He understood that freedom is won in millimeters, and every bottle sold, every thank you received, was a small victory. A crack in the invisible prison he'd lived in for so long. A notebook became his first ledger. In it, James wrote everything. How many bottles he sold each day, how much he invested, how much was left. He started noticing patterns. Which streets had more foot traffic? Which hours were most profitable? He learned by observing, learned by trying, and above all, learned by failing. There were days he lost everything by trusting too much. Others when he bought wrong and ran out of stock. But every mistake was a strict teacher, and James was determined to be the best student in that brutal school called the street. Over time, he branched out, started selling cereal bars, packs of tissues, anything he could offer value with for little investment. He saved every spare cent, and when he scraped together a bigger sum, he did something bold. He bought a small, used food cart from a community thrift shop. It was rusty, beat up, but it had potential. He fixed it up with help from a mechanic who was also homeless, paid with meals and gratitude. The cart became his new battle station, a new beginning. The first sale was like an explosion inside him. When a dollar bill passed from one hand to another, James didn't just see money. He saw respect. He saw possibility. He kept that dollar folded in his pocket like it was gold. It was the first brick of his rebuilding. With the little he earned, he started eating better, used public restrooms to stay clean, visited the library every day, watched videos, read articles about street businesses, entrepreneurial mindset, even sales techniques. It was as if his mind, once dormant, was starving for knowledge. He had nothing, but inside him, something was growing with unstoppable force. And so, with a water bottle, a note, and a choice, James took the first step on a journey that would take him far beyond the streets. James didn't have a company. He didn't have a known name. But in that moment, he was already a different man. Every step he took was a silent declaration of war against the misery trying to define him. And it wasn't an easy war, far from it. There were days when selling water barely earned enough for a sandwich, nights when his body begged for rest and his mind nearly gave in to despair. But James kept going. He understood that freedom is won in millimeters, and every bottle sold, every thank you received, was a small victory. A crack in the invisible prison he'd lived in for so long. A notebook became his first ledger. In it, James wrote everything. How many bottles he sold each day, how much he invested, how much was left. He started noticing patterns. Which streets had more foot traffic? Which hours were most profitable? He learned by observing, learned by trying, and above all, learned by failing. There were days he lost everything by trusting too much. Others when he bought wrong and ran out of stock. But every mistake was a strict teacher, and James was determined to be the best student in that brutal school called the street. Over time, he branched out, started selling cereal bars, packs of tissues, anything he could offer value with for little investment. He saved every spare cent, and when he scraped together a bigger sum, he did something bold. He bought a small, used food cart from a community thrift shop. It was rusty, beat up, but it had potential. He fixed it up with help from a mechanic who was also homeless, paid with meals and gratitude. The cart became his new battle station, a new beginning. People started to notice. "Who's this guy with so much energy?" they'd ask. James built connections, listened to stories, made friends, and above all, built a reputation. His products were simple, but his service was memorable. He didn't just sell coffee, he sold humanity. A warm good morning, a genuine smile, a brief chat that made a difference. Customers came back, they spread the word, and the money started coming in more steadily. With his earnings, he rented a small room in a far-off neighborhood. For the first time in years, he had a roof he could call his own. A place where he could lock the door and sleep without fear, where he could dream without interruption. It was simple. 4 walls, a bed, an electric stove. But to James, it was a palace, a symbol of everything he'd overcome so far. But his hunger for freedom wasn't satisfied. With internet access, James started studying digital marketing. He wanted to understand how businesses grew beyond the sidewalks. He discovered stories of other entrepreneurs, learned about branding, customer loyalty, even opened a social media account to promote his products. Soon, the street cart had a name, a logo, and even orders placed by text. What was once a fight to survive was now the seed of a much bigger dream. James had conquered the street, but now he was ready to take on the world. James was ready, but the world had no idea what he was about to become. The brand that started as a makeshift coffee cart on the streets of New York now had an identity, a name, a loyal following, a raw and powerful story behind it. Veteran Brew, as he named his business, was more than a mobile cafe. It was a symbol. Every cup sold carried a message of overcoming, rebuilding, hope. And when a local influencer discovered the story behind that smile on the sidewalk, everything changed. The video got over 500,000 views in under 48 hours. The caption read, "This man survived the streets. Today, he serves the best coffee I've ever had." The internet did what it does best. It spread. And with it came new customers, new attention, new investors. Within a week, James had lines to buy his coffee. Within a month, he needed to hire 2 helpers. Within 6, he opened his first brick-and-mortar shop. Small, modest, but with the identity he built himself, with reclaimed wood and black and white photos of his journey lining the walls. The media caught on. Magazines, newspapers, TV shows, all wanted to meet the man who turned nothing into a profitable, inspiring business. He was featured on a local magazine cover, won social entrepreneurship awards, was invited to speak at universities, schools, community events. But James never lost focus. He still woke up at 5 a.m., still made coffee with his own hands, still insisted on serving customers in person. And then came the first million. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't overnight, but it came. The shops grew, the chain expanded. Investors offered partnerships. James opened branches in other neighborhoods. He created reintegration programs for the homeless, hiring former street dwellers as baristas, cashiers, managers. He turned his pain into a social project. His company now had impact. Profit, yes, but with purpose. He knew what it was to sleep on the sidewalk, and he made sure no one else had to go through it without at least a chance. A journalist once asked, "What's the secret to your success?" James answered without hesitation. "It wasn't a secret, it was a decision. I decided to get up, and I never stopped." His story inspired documentaries, books, even an indie film, but nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what he felt opening the shop's door every day and seeing someone being valued. He hadn't just rebuilt his life, but his place in the world. But James wasn't done, because those who survive hell don't come back just for themselves. They come back to save others too. James knew true success wasn't measured by the numbers in a bank account. It was measured by the quiet impact we leave on the world when no one's watching. He, who was once invisible on the streets of New York, now made a point to see those still out there. He knew their names, their stories, their pain, because he too had been a number, a glance avoided, a presence ignored in the daily rush. And now, with his empire built brick by brick, he turned his life into a bridge for those still trying to cross the abyss. He created the Second Chance Project, an institute focused on training former homeless people, a place where they learned about customer service, personal finance, emotional development, entrepreneurship. More than a job opportunity, James offered belonging. He offered dignity. Many who went through it now have their own businesses, restored families, reclaimed lives, and they all knew it was because someone believed in them when no one else did. In one of his most memorable talks, James said something the audience never forgot. "You can lose everything in life. Your home, your name, even your identity. But if one thread of faith remains, grab it. Because a thread of faith, well tied, is enough to pull you back." Those words became a mural at the Institute. They were printed on t-shirts, tattooed on the skin of some who heard them and chose not to give up. Because that's James's legacy. Not the money, not the awards, not the TV appearances, but the ability to light a match in the dark and teach others to do the same. His story doesn't end with $1 million account. It ends with a chain of transformation that keeps spreading, even when the lights go out. Because this story, that began with silence, cold, and abandonment, ends with echoes of hope crossing generations. James proved to the world that today's defeated can be tomorrow's leaders. That pain, when faced with courage, becomes the most powerful force there is, and that every human, even at rock bottom, still carries a seed of greatness inside. If this story touched you, remember two things. First, never underestimate the power of a fresh start. And second, share this story with someone who needs to believe again. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a like. Not because we ask, but because stories like James's need to keep being told.